The swamp was quiet again. Black water lapped against the wreckage, steaming gently in the humid Florida night. Trees trembled in silence, their branches bent low with mist and the scent of jet fuel. Somewhere out there in the darkness, a woman was screaming, not from pain, but disbelief. Moments earlier, she had been looking out the window of an airplane, watching the lights of Miami draw near. Now, she was trapped beneath torn aluminum and twisted cables. The roar of the crash had faded. The sound of survival had just begun. This is the story of Eastern Airlines Flight 401, one of the most avoidable, haunting aviation disasters in U.S. history. A story where the technology worked, the engines worked, the crew was experienced, but none of it mattered because of a single burned-out light bulb. It was December 29, 1972. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was scheduled to depart from New York's JFK Airport, bound for Miami. It was a routine flight, something the crew had done countless times. The aircraft was a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, one of the most advanced commercial airliners of its era, a wide-body jet with state-of-the-art instrumentation and triple redundant safety systems. The captain that night was Bob Loft, a seasoned veteran with over 30 years of flying experience. His first officer, Albert Stockstill, was sharp and capable. The flight engineer, Don Repo, was known for his precision and calm demeanor. There were 163 passengers and 13 crew members on board. The takeoff from New York was uneventful. The flight was smooth, the weather clear. As the aircraft approached Miami late that night, the crew was cleared for landing on runway 9 left. Everything was perfectly normal, until it wasn't. As they prepared to lower the landing gear, the indicator light that confirmed the nose gear was locked into place didn't illuminate. A tiny green bulb on the control panel, no larger than a coin, failed to light up. The pilot suspected the gear might not be fully extended. It was a critical concern. Landing without nose gear could be catastrophic. But the light not coming on didn't necessarily mean the gear had failed. It could just be a burned-out bulb. They radioed the control tower and requested to enter a holding pattern while they investigated. Air traffic control approved. The crew turned the aircraft west over the dark, flat expanse of the Florida Everglades. At 11:34 p.m., Flight 401 began to circle at 2,000 feet. Inside the cockpit, the crew became focused on the light. Captain Loft asked First Officer Stockstill to set the plane on autopilot, then turned to troubleshoot. Repo crawled down into the avionics bay beneath the flight deck to check visually whether the gear was down. What no one noticed was this. The autopilot had quietly disengaged. Stockstill had bumped the control yoke while turning to look at the indicator panel, and without realizing it, nudged the column enough to switch the system from altitude hold to a gradual descent. Over the next 10 minutes, Flight 401 began to descend, very slowly, just under 200 feet per minute. A drop subtle enough that no one in the cockpit felt it. They were too busy talking about the bulb. The cockpit voice recorder captures their discussion. They joked about changing the bulb. They tried removing the panel. They asked each other if maybe the landing gear just hadn't locked. But never once did any of them call out the aircraft's current altitude. It kept sinking. The warning chime for altitude deviation never sounded, because the system was disabled when the plane was in manual vertical mode. They had no idea. At 11:41 p.m., just 7 minutes into the descent, First Officer Stockstill noticed something strange. "We're at 2,000 feet, right?" he asked. That's when the captain realized something was wrong. They checked the altimeter. The aircraft was at 900 feet. Within seconds, the crew went from confusion to panic. Stockstill tried to pull the aircraft up. Captain Loft yelled for full power, but it was too late. At 11:42 p.m., Flight 401 struck the Florida Everglades at over 200 miles per hour. The fuselage sheared apart on impact, skipping across the swamp like a thrown stone. Trees tore through the cabin. Seats and passengers were ripped from the aircraft. Some were crushed instantly, others drowned within moments, trapped under twisted metal in waist-deep water. And yet, miraculously, 75 people survived. Those who lived later described the crash as a surreal rupture of reality. One minute, they were buckled into their seats. The next, they were flung into a swamp, surrounded by screams, smoke, and darkness. Rescue was agonizingly slow. The Everglades were remote. Access was limited. Helicopters struggled to land on the marshy ground. First responders waded through thick vegetation, pulling survivors out one by one. Alligators and snakes slithered nearby. Time was cruel. Among the dead were Captain Loft and First Officer Stockstill. Don Repo, the flight engineer, survived the initial impact, but died later in the hospital from his injuries. When investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board examined the flight recorders, the cause became depressingly clear. There was nothing wrong with the landing gear. It had deployed perfectly. The light bulb had burned out. That was it. A 69-cent bulb had distracted a cockpit of highly trained professionals so completely that no one noticed the plane was descending toward the ground. The crash of Flight 401 changed aviation forever. It was a wake-up call, a brutal lesson in human factors and cockpit resource management. The idea that a crew could be so focused on a minor issue that they lost track of their primary task, flying the airplane, was deeply unsettling. Out of that tragedy, the concept of crew resource management (CRM) was born. Pilots were retrained to prioritize communication, monitor one another's actions, and distribute workload. Checklists were revised, warning systems were updated, redundancy protocols were strengthened. Flight 401 also led to changes in how cockpit design accounted for human error. Autopilot modes were clarified, altitude warnings were restructured, and the industry slowly came to accept that most aviation disasters weren't just mechanical failures, but failures of attention, coordination, and human oversight. The passengers of Flight 401 didn't die because of bad weather. They didn't die because of terrorism or sabotage. They died because the people flying the plane were doing everything except flying the plane. There's one final chapter to this story, one that lives in whispers and superstition. After the crash, salvaged parts from the wreckage were reused in other Eastern Airlines aircraft, standard practice at the time. But soon after, reports began to surface. Crew aboard other planes claimed they saw a man in the galley dressed in Eastern Airlines uniform, who vanished without a trace. Some recognized him as Don Repo. A flight attendant reported seeing him staring silently in a mirror. Pilots claimed they heard his voice warning them of mechanical issues, moments before failures occurred. None of these stories were officially confirmed. Eastern Airlines dismissed them as legend, but within the airline, the tales of the ghost of Flight 401 became the stuff of lore. Eventually, Eastern stopped using salvaged parts from the wreck. But the ghost that truly mattered wasn't a spirit in the galley. It was the echo of a lesson, written in metal, water, and blood. That even in the most advanced aircraft, with the best crews, human distraction can kill. And when systems fail or go unnoticed, it's always the innocent who pay the price. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.